The easiest bottle to sell is the first one. It's new. People are willing to try it. But at the end of the day, the product has to carry the load because you're changing habits. If somebody has their preferred drink, in order to make them switch, they have to like yours better.
Troy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Let's just start with a little bit of your background and how you got started in the whiskey business.
Oh, kind of a winding road on my background, but I guess from the very beginning. So I grew up in West Texas. Family was in the oil and gas business. Went to Texas Tech. Didn't really know what I wanted to do after college. Kind of fell into, what the family was doing, oil and gas, and I didn't really want to do kind of land work or operations or anything like that. I wanted to do something in the finance field. And so I ended up moving to Houston and worked in the oil and gas private equity side of the business, which, as it turned out, was a phenomenal experience.
Yeah.
Learning about fundraising, learning about, how to build teams, strategy, all those things. And working essentially, the equivalent of two jobs because you're, there at all hours, but got a lot of great experience from that. And then I was brought or hired, I guess, out of that shop to come to Fort Worth to help run a finance department for an oil and gas company, which was kind of an interesting switch, being on the sponsor side and then moving over to the operations side. And so I got to learn, a whole new set of skills on the operations side. And then, after a while, I was just kind of felt this itch to do my own thing. And I had a lot of hobbies. I'm a hobbyist and like to learn and, try new things and figure out how things work. And one of those things that I was really interested in at the time was whiskey. I'd kind of, started dabbling and trying different styles. And of course, in college, I tried to brew my own beer and it came out terrible. But kind of, going back on those experiences, really, starting to learn about whiskey, kind of geeking out on, what makes one whiskey different than the other and trying different styles. And, that just kind of led me down a rabbit hole of, really wanting to learn about, how do people make whiskey and, what's entailed. And so about that time, we had, sold our assets of that business and we were thinking about starting a new oil and gas company. And, we were kind of in this limbo period. And so, weren't really working on anything, full time. And then about that time, I guess, is when Tito's was doing a lot of advertising and really, hit my radar. And then I just thought to myself, I wonder if anybody's doing this for whiskey, just out of curiosity. And so then just kind of got on the internet and was looking around, and there were a couple of groups in Austin and a couple of other very small fledgling kind of startups that were happening. And then, I was like, I really want to dig into this a little bit deeper and see, is there an opportunity there? Because, as I was evaluating what I wanted to do next, of course, I wanted to, create a business. It needed to make money. But I really wanted to find something that I was, passionate about and interested in to sink my teeth into. And I'll also say, working on the finance side of the oil business, there wasn't a tangibility of it. It just wasn't tangible. I couldn't feel it. I couldn't touch it. And so I don't think I knew it at the time, but that was something that was really, of interest to me. And so ultimately, just kind of, as I said, went down that rabbit hole of, figuring out, what's out there, who's doing this, is there a market? And then probably after checking a lot of the boxes, probably the biggest one for me that kind of allowed me to ultimately, step off the ledge, so to speak, was, finding out that Texas was the second largest consuming state of whiskey in the country, but very little of it was made here. So I was like, wow, if I could just build a business, that would be successful in Texas, that'd be a sizable business.
Yep.
So kind of, that's what kicked it off.
Yeah, I think you just answered the question. Was that the final turning point? I wrote down like at what point had all your boxes been checked that you're like, all right, there's an opportunity here. Was that it?
That was the last one.
Okay.
Yeah. And at the time I had a 2-year-old and one on the way. Had not made a ton of money, so I wasn't independently wealthy. Had a little bit in savings. And, my wife, who, comes from a banking background, is very astute and kind of sizing up ideas. And I knew that was going to be a tough conversation. And so I knew I had to kind of have all my ducks in a row and really think this out. And so went through that process without really her knowing anything about it. And then once I did kind of, check all those boxes, I had that conversation and I said, don't hit me here, but just hear me out. And ultimately, laid it out for her. And she said, you know what, I'll support you 100%.
That's
let's
awesome.
do it.
So you came home and I'm assuming it was a series of conversations, which like, I want to start a whiskey business.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And I was a little nervous, very nervous about having that conversation, because it was a huge departure from what I was doing, obviously.
All right. So we'll get into like how the business is built, but why was nobody doing this in Texas? Like, what did you found at that point? Was there anything that was like, there's a reason why nobody's doing this, or is it just the opportunity hadn't come here yet?
Well, to be clear, there were people that were in business trying it, but they were so small that it wasn't really mainstream in any of the major markets. But Tito's had started to climb that mountain and get national exposure. And so one of the things that I was trying to figure out is why isn't anyone doing this? And, there wasn't really a cut and dry answer other than, later on we'd figure out that, most people think that bourbon has to come from Kentucky. And so, if you're making whiskey or bourbon in Texas, you can't do that because it has to be made in Kentucky. Which was an interesting conversation to have with people because people really believe that. But the fact of the matter is that, Tito really was the one that paved the way for craft distillers in Texas. Some laws had kind of changed a little bit. And then ultimately, figured out that, there's nothing that prevents anyone from making whiskey in Texas if you have the right permits. And
I'm a total noob here, but what about Kentucky is it just like that's just like history and tradition, or is there some type of plant or something there that makes it have to be in Kentucky?
Well, I think it's that's where bourbon was made.
Okay.
Since, even before Prohibition.
Okay.
There's kind of a hot spot for bourbon. So, when we were doing all of our research, we figured out that, actually you can make bourbon in Texas, and their laws are very, specific and strict on what you have to follow to do it. But, and mainly having a distiller's license, which was a significant feat in and of itself to start.
Do you have to have a distiller's license before you can do anything? Is that like step one?
Yes. So, it is illegal to make distilled spirits without a license. And so, one of the interesting things that we learned, and this is kind of, if we would have known all the things, all the hurdles that we would have had to gone through at that time, it would have been really difficult to kind of push through.
Yeah.
So thankfully, ignorance is bliss in a lot of ways. But, one of the things that we learned was that you had to have your building secured. You had to have the serial numbers of your equipment to just put on your application, which is a significant capital outlay even before you are authorized to distill. So there were some kind of sleepless nights there, deploying that capital and waiting for the federal government to give you your license.
So going back just a second. So you come home, you get approval from your wife. which I think that's a common thread with every successful entrepreneur, is a supportive spouse and one that's willing to overlook a little bit of the madness. So what happened from there? Like, I kind of want to go through how this got built. We talked a little bit about the license, but how did your partnership come to be? And then how did you, like, what'd you raise money on? Like, how are those what'd that first year look like to get this thing off the ground?
Yeah, great question. So when I decided that I was going to, pursue it full time, it was just me. I had started to develop a business plan, had a lot of experience in doing that, from my private equity days, knew I was going to have to raise capital and just started kind of pursuing that and getting up the learning curve. Well, part of that due diligence process was visiting a distiller down in the Austin area, a small bourbon producer. I went down there, and then within probably 10 minutes of meeting with him, he said, another guy from Fort Worth is coming to see me in a week. And I said, no kidding. Who's that? And he said, it's Leonard Firestone. And I said, I know Leonard. I knew his brother really well. And that was kind of a deflating moment because I thought I was the only one with the idea.
Yeah.
So, pursued the tour. After the tour, got in my car, called Chris, his brother. I said, hey, I need your brother Leonard's number. So I'm literally on the road back from Austin, call Leonard, said, hey, I hear you want to get in the whiskey business. He said, how do you know that? I said, well, and I told him the connection. And I said, why don't we get together? Let's talk. And at the time I'm thinking, I want to size up my competition.
Yeah.
And I think he's thinking the same thing. So we figured out a time to meet that week, met, and it was just, had a 3-hour conversation. And, if you've ever been in that situation where you meet somebody that, kind of kindred spirits, if you know, kind of thing. And, I knew at the time that, he was a straight shooter. I knew it was going to be a tall mountain to climb. I think he realized the same thing. And so, had a great first meeting and then had, 3 or 4 follow-up conversations. And then we ultimately decided, hey, let's, this is going to be a tough, road to hoe. Let's partner and do it together. So that's how we developed the partnership. So then literally I'm still in the office downtown of, kind of with my oil and gas friends. Leonard didn't have an office. I said, hey, we've got an open office here. Come up here. Let's, start working on this. He had a business plan about halfway done. I had a business plan about halfway done. And we literally began to merge those business plans. And thankfully, the ideas and the, strategies were pretty lockstep. So over the next probably 7 months, 8 months, we finished that. We developed a pitch book, and then, we had to go and raise money. This was in 2009. So right after, the subprime crisis hit, where, everyone was really skittish about investing. And so we hit the road and, just kind of circled the wagons on our, networks, friends, family, old oil and gas acquaintances, and started, pitching this idea. And, looking back on it, if you think about, the proposition, we laugh about it. It's here, there's 2 guys, never, distilled anything in their life, pitching this business to make whiskey. We don't have a product for you to taste. We don't have a brand developed yet. And it's just a big trust me. And, we got a lot of no's, definitely a lot more no's than yeses. And it took about, all told, almost a full year to raise a small amount of capital. But we just kind of stuck with it. And of course, like any, entrepreneur, you've got a target in mind of how much money you want to raise, and you end up raising less.
Yeah.
But we had kind of reworked the plan and felt really comfortable with, how much we had raised, and felt like, it gave us enough, runway to, deploy the capital for the equipment, and then, get all of our first bottles and, a little bit of marketing dollars. Um, and so we closed that round in, I believe, June of 2010. Um, and then we were off.
So you said that you had to have your license, but you also had to have the equipment, tags, and a location. Was there anything about the location that had to meet certain criteria for there to be a distillery in Texas, or was it just industrial zoning? Or
Light industrial was required for Fort Worth.
Yeah.
And, beyond the kind of specific zoning requirements, for us, we felt like it was important to be centrally located because we knew that, whiskey was starting to become more and more popular. We wanted, our customers and to be able to come to the distillery to see it in action. We felt like that was going to be a big differentiator for us. If they had to drive an hour, we weren't going to get near the foot traffic that we were hoping for. And then it had to have kind of that feel of a distillery. And so thankfully we found a great, 1920s era building right on the south side of 35 on Vickery that was just kind of sitting there empty. And again, real estate down on South Main area, it was still kind of a transient area.
Yeah.
But, we loved it very much like your kind of red brick here.
Yeah.
It had that look and feel and wood columns. And so we thought it was perfect.
We'll get into whiskey in a little bit, but I think it would be fun to go through just kind of how the brand came to be. We can talk about the caps, but one of the things y'all did really well that I think as a customer was TX whiskey. It just felt really good. It obviously tasted good. It was a great brand. How did you take that initial money and then start developing the concept? And we'll get into kind of how the first deal was a blend, but as far as just how it became TX whiskey, how you picked the bottle, how you picked the cap, we would be doing the listeners a disservice not to hear all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So during the time that Leonard and I were kind of, putting together our pitch deck and our plan, our strategy, we had a giant whiteboard, really floor to ceiling of names. And we would, think about a name one day and put it up on the board, and, we'd just kind of stare at them and revisit them. And TX was on there early on, but it was written like you would write, the state on an envelope. One of the things that we wanted to do that was important to us is we didn't want to be kind of cliche Texas. Like we always called it airport Texan, where you go in the airport, you see the boot, keychain, and we wanted to create a brand that resembled, what Texas meant to us. Of course, we wore boots, but we didn't necessarily, have a ranch, and we didn't have horses and all those things. And so, we kind of developed this catchphrase of, rugged elegance. That's what Texas means to us. In Fort Worth specifically, where you've got, the dichotomy of the stockyards all the way to, the modern museum.
Yeah.
So this great range of content or, visuals to play with. And so, as I said, TX was on there. We thought it was just a little too, cliche or basic. And so we just kept, struggling to find names and struggling to come up with something cool. And then one day we're in there and kind of beating our head against the wall. And I can't remember who did it, whether it was Leonard or myself. We kind of, flipped the TX vertically somehow. And we both looked at it. We're like, that looks like a really cool, stylized, cattle brand, which totally changed, the look and feel and our perspective on that name. And so we just, we both loved it and we ran with it. And we said, is it going to be polarizing? Potentially, but, who cares? Texas is iconic. And we loved it. So that was kind of, how we arrived at the name to pursue. And then the packaging, as I said, we didn't want to be cliche or predictable, but, we really wanted it to resemble where we're from. Having elements on the bottle is really important. It needs to be, beautiful to the consumer on the shelf, to attract them to buy it, but also, it needs to be purposeful. One of the brands that we were, big fans of was Maker's Mark, which I think Maker's does a tremendous job of kind of, having that differentiator red wax.
The red wax.
Yeah. And no two are the same. And it's just a really, great brand, and iconic brand because of it. And so, we kept telling ourselves, what can be our red wax? And one day, I'm a hobbyist woodworker, got a wood shop at home. And, one day we had the idea of, it'd be really cool if we could, somehow use, boot leather on our, bottle somehow. And I started playing around in my shop, with the bottle cap. So I have a lathe and I was, literally, creating these bottle top pieces. And I go into my closet, and I'm a big boot guy. I got lots of boots. But I grabbed one of my ostrich boots and I ended up punching a hole, or cutting out a hole on the upper part of the boot, with the stitching, and, fashioned this top that I thought was just epic. It was so cool. And it was rough and interesting. Total side note, if you go to the distillery today, I think it's in the bottling line, we have a shadow box with the original prototypes that I built,
really?
which is neat.
That's awesome.
But put that together, took a picture of it, sent it to Leonard, and I said, "What do you think about this?" And he goes, "That's it."
That's awesome.
So the next step was, okay, that's really cool, and kind of figured out how we can, put it together. How are we going to make hundreds of these? How are we going to make thousands of these? We're going to need a lot of leather. And so
you can't just keep carving your boots up.
That's right. And we weren't going to go buy boots to, make tops. And so that's when we had the idea, let's go to some local boot makers and, show them what we're doing, see what they think about it. And the first person that we went to was Wilson Franklin at Letty's. We walked in with, I think at that time, maybe a bottle prototype with a bottle top. And we showed it to him and said, "Hey, what do you think about this? We need, a partner." And he thought it was super cool. And he said, we get these, skins, and we cut all of our boot parts out of them. And, there are some little strips that, could be big enough for your, little circle. And he said, "We'd love them." And so he goes in the back and he gets us a box. He said, "Try this first." And the first box he gave us were some of the most exotic, cool, colorful, leathers that he had. And so we made, I don't know, maybe 200 tops out of that, and realized that, we could do that. We could do it in scale.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's kind of become an iconic thing. And even the shape of the bottle, I think, is iconic. I'm assuming that wasn't like, hey, we'll just take that one. Was there any, thought and process put into the shape of the bottle?
Actually, it's a stock bottle.
Oh, it is?
It is a stock bottle. So
Okay.
we didn't have enough money to, invest in molds because it's expensive. And so we found a stock bottle, but what we wanted to do was make it different enough to where, it didn't look stock. And so, the bottle tops were a big part of the story, and, the story of TX and, what it resembled. But then some of the other elements were very carefully thought out, like the canvas around the neck. That's a nod to, the chuck wagons, and the stagecoaches of the West. It's a very tactile, feeling product. And, it kind of meets that rugged elegance where, when you pour it out of the bottle, it catches those drips and kind of stains it a little bit.
Yeah.
We kind of liked that. It didn't need to be super polished.
Yeah.
So that, and then, there's a silver band around the base, and that is a nod to kind of the conchos and the belt buckles and kind of, the saddlery and silver, parts of, our cowboy heritage.
I always loved chatting with you about this stuff because everything was like intentional. Nothing really was a mistake. There was a lot of, or not a mistake, but just a, quick decision. Everything had a purpose and a place. If you're starting a distillery business, it's like starting an orchard of some sort. You got to plant the stuff. It's not even ready for years. So let's spend some time talking about the blend versus what all had to happen over years to actually get y'all's proprietary or the stuff that y'all were distilling
The bourbon.
ready for market. Yep.
No, great question. So you're absolutely right. I guess by law, to be called, we knew we wanted to develop a straight bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is, along with some other requirements, it has to be 2 years in the barrel at a minimum. And then through a lot of our research and talking with, a lot of people in Kentucky, the 2 years isn't enough to really mature the product. And so, most bourbon out there, if it's, it's a minimum of 4 years old, especially the Kentucky bourbons. And then it goes up from there. And so we didn't have the capital to just, produce bourbon, sit on it for 2 to 4 years, and then release it. We knew we needed to come up with a product, but we didn't want it to be, something that was just, buying existing, bourbon, putting it in a bottle, slapping a name on it. It had to have our fingerprints on it. And so we started talking with people in the industry about, what are the options here? Blended whiskey was kind of a 4-letter word at that time. People didn't appreciate blended whiskey. And, definitely most of the American whiskey out there was bourbon. Canadian whiskey, on the other hand, a lot of it is blended whiskey. And so, again, going back to our diligence, we looked at, what's one of the most popular whiskeys in Texas right now? And it was Crown Royal. Crown Royal is a Canadian blended whiskey. And we're like, well, if that's the most popular whiskey, then clearly, Texans like that profile, like that blended profile. Let's create our own blend. And so that led us down a whole nother, education process of, what it takes to create a blend. And arguably, it's more or can be more difficult than creating a straight bourbon, as we learned.
Why?
Because you are having to take different components and with different ratios and trying to target a certain taste profile.
Got it.
Whereas a straight bourbon, you're creating the mash, you're distilling it, you're putting it in a barrel, and you're waiting. You empty the barrel. There is some mingling. You can mingle barrels at the end of bourbon to kind of modify profiles a bit. But for the most part, it's, taking, disparate, different types of whiskeys to create, something that is delicious. And so we worked on that for a really long time, probably 6-8 months.
And how does that work though? Is it you go into like a lab and they have all these and you're just kind of tasting and going? Like, how does that part actually play out?
Later in the history of the distillery, we did have a lab. Early on, we did not have a lab.
Yeah, you had your garage or something.
We had the distillery, but we would, procure these different samples and then literally, do blend test after blend test after blend test.
But you would just order all the ingredients that could go into a blend. Obviously, you found some vendor and you would just say, just ship us samples of this, and y'all were just kind of mixing mixology on your own, or was somebody kind of showing you how to do it?
We were basically doing it on our own.
Okay.
And having to go find different sources because you don't want to, pull your sourced whiskey from one location, because then, you don't have a lot of variability in how you can modify the taste profile. So we wanted to get different styles of whiskey from different locations, so that we could have, a lot of options. And so, yeah, it was just us, me, Leonard, and at that time we had hired our head distiller, Rob Arnold, and just the three of us tried iteration after iteration. And, a lot of consumer product brands use focus groups. We didn't use a focus group. We just said, what do we like? And we felt like that if we liked it, we didn't have obscure taste. If we liked it and it was down the fairway of something that, Texans already liked, then, it was going to work. Now
That had to be a fun phase, getting a little buzz before lunch, before the afternoon meetings. You said it took months, and it seems like in every part of y'all's story, there's kind of been this aha moment of, this is the name, this is the cap. When was it finally like, aha, we have the ingredients?
It was a process of, I would say, 100 to 150 different iterations. And it's, we kind of get down, we would narrow it down to, the stock whiskeys that we liked. And then it was just a matter of, refining. It's like, okay, a little too, peppery, let's dial that back. So ultimately, it was just kind of tweaking little by little. And we'd sit on it for a week or two. Yeah, this is really good. This is really good. And then, you drink it for a week and you're like, no, it's not that good. We've got to change it. It's a very unscientific, really.
Yeah. Okay. So you decide this is going to be our blend. What happens from there?
Then the real eye-opening moment comes, and talk about being naive. I think when we started, we knew that, to sell liquor, there was effectively a 3-tier system. So the 3 tiers, and these were developed after Prohibition, but the 3 tiers are the manufacturer, which is what a distiller is, a distributor, and then a retailer. If you belong in one of those, you can't own or belong or have the other 2. So if you're a distiller, you can't sell your product direct. If you're a wholesaler, you can't be a distiller, so on and so forth. And so the laws required us to have a distributor. Well, again, being naive, thinking, oh, well, we'll just go grab a distributor and, they'll come pick it up and they'll take it to the retailers and the restaurants and, it's great.
Why isn't everybody doing that?
That was kind of afterthought. Well, in reality, distribution is tough. They are, and by this point, there was a lot of consolidation with distributors in Texas, and so there were really kind of 2 main distributors. And if you think about, if the law says that all liquor has to be sold by a distributor, and there are 2 in the state, and that means that those 2 basically, sell and manage all brands, and those brands are the Jim Beams of the world and, the TXs of the world. And so, realizing that, they had finite resources and, only a certain number of salespeople, again, thinking like, hey, we give you the product, it, immediately gets distributed. That was an eye-opening moment. Realizing that, in fact, we had to be the ones out there creating the pull in the market, that would then trigger them to send their reps to go and deliver product.
You had to find customers. And then at the early stage, you would just say, okay, Mr. Distributor, we now have customers, start distributing to them.
Well, specifically, you would go to a bar or restaurant and, give them a trial of your whiskey and really try to sell them and bringing it in. And you're learning all of these things like, shelf space and, there's a saying, a battle of inches. If you go into any bar, they have a finite amount of real estate on their back bar and with an infinite number of brands. And so, any bar that you go into, you're basically having to talk them into taking one of those bottles off and putting yours on, which can be challenging. And so we learned a lot in that process, but, at the end of the day, the customer wins. And so we realized that we really needed people to get behind the brand and, change their taste profile, really.
What was the early pitch to folks when you're bringing a whiskey? Like you just said, there could be 50 bottles of whiskey behind the bar. Like, how do you pitch? Why would they take one off and put yours on? Besides, maybe you're from Fort Worth and they know you, but beyond that,
well, in the very early days, so there was an article written about us before we launched the product, which helped tremendously. And I'll say this, and Leonard will too, that, a huge part of our success was the loyalty of Fort Worth, um, because and we were the first whiskey distillery in North Texas, um, which was a big deal because there wasn't any competition, and so I think it was really unique and new, and people were excited. And Mad Men, the show, was on, and people were learning about whiskey, and there was kind of this new renaissance happening. So timing was really good, but they so that article came out. The distributor, we gave them one pallet of whiskey, which was, I don't know, 200 and something bottles. And they thought at the time, this will take about a month and a half to 2 months to sell this. Well, they pick it up, start, putting it in liquor stores. The article had come out previously, so there was built up demand, and that sold out of that within, I don't know, a couple of days. And then they called us and they said, we are out of whiskey. We need more. And what they didn't realize is that first pallet. So at the time we had, I don't know, maybe 5 of us working, and we were, doing the blending, building the tops ourselves. We were, had a little 4-spout manual filler. We had a little manual machine to put the silver around the bottom. We were hand gluing the canvas around the neck. Hugely labor intensive.
Yeah.
Took us probably a week to do that pallet alone. And they're saying we need, 3 pallets in 4 days. And so that was kind of a major, good problem to have, but challenging problem as well. So we, I can go on for days with these stories, but one in particular was, as soon as we heard that, we were really excited, obviously, but then we, did a lot of trial and error. Okay, let's use, day workers to come in and help, do a lot of the bottle assembly, and, that ebbed and flowed. We started with 20, and, there were all kinds of issues with that, and went back to 10, and then do we hire full-time, part-time? Anyway, it was a mess. So that was and the other funny thing is, people don't think of summer as being the optimum time to launch a whiskey. Summer is not typically a good time of year for whiskey. But we decided to launch it June 12th.
Hottest day of the year.
But it worked out.
When is whiskey the best? Fall and winter?
Winter months.
Yeah.
Colder generally. We refer to as OND, October, November, December. Gift giving, all the things that really help sell whiskey.
Just taking a step back for a second, you kind of earlier on just mentioned Tito's several times. As you sit back today, like what made Tito's successful, and maybe what are some of the things that you guys incorporated into your company because maybe you saw Tito's doing it?
Well, I think Tito's was successful. One reason he was successful is because he was the first in Texas.
Okay.
I think another reason he was successful, that to your point of what we kind of mimicked, was he put his face out there. No one else had really done that before. A brand was created, or maybe it was named after someone who has passed on, whatever. He really put himself out there, and I think people really gravitated to that. They wanted. We started referring to it as face, place, product. Having a face out there, a person that somebody can see and relate to. And so he was really the first to do that, and I think that was a major change for the industry, and really probably contributed greatly to success.
Yeah, I'll brag on y'all for a little. I'm big into branding and marketing. I think it's y'all's story in branding and marketing is one of the best I've ever seen. It's just a great brand. It's just a great brand. Putting the face with it. And maybe that leads to my next question, which is, it seems like every celebrity now is attaching themselves to the next great tequila or vodka. Is that a bubble? is there too much alcohol? Like, is there room for everybody, or what do you think about like the current market as it relates to putting that face with a brand?
Well, I think is it saturated? It certainly can be. I mean, there are certain brands like Casamigos, for instance, with George Clooney and Randy Gerber, who were hugely successful. But I think it comes down to an authentic story is really the game changer for some of these brands. We tried really hard to be as authentic as we possibly could. Putting ourselves out there, really spending time on purposeful product development, purposeful branding, purposeful bottle elements, and I think they use them as an example. Had a great story. It's three guys that love tequila that were hanging out down in Mexico and decided to put a brand together.
Yeah.
The ones that just whether it's a going concern that is just looking for a face to attach to it, I think have harder time selling and getting to scale just because there's a face attached to it.
Yeah. I think we talked about this at lunch last time. Brand versus flavor. How much of a great alcohol business has to do with the flavor and the product itself versus the brand? And maybe that's an extension of the question I just asked you, but when you think about those two, are they equally as important? Can you overcome flavor if your brand is awesome, or is it vice versa?
No. So the way we looked at it was the easiest bottle to sell is the first one. It's new. People are willing to try it. But at the end of the day, the product has to carry the load because you're changing habits. And so if somebody has their preferred drink, whether it's beer, wine, whiskey, they've been drinking a certain brand because they like it for a long time. In order to make them switch, they have to like yours better. And so, product wins.
Got it. Okay. Kind of going back. So the blend is taken off. You kind of got your distributor worked out. Just talk a little bit about the first couple of big accounts or big sales. Was there any pivotal customers that took y'all on that kind of moved it to the next floor? Was it just a bunch of restaurants around town? Like, what kind of got the sales pouring in?
For a long time, there was more demand than supply, which was a great thing to have. And again, thankful to the people of Fort Worth, because they would go and stand in line for hours, literally, or put themselves on waiting lists. So, the way you sell in this industry is off premise and on premise. Off premise would be the liquor stores. On premise are all the bars, restaurants, hotels, etc. Certain brands do better on the on premise, so the bars, restaurants. Others do better on the off premise. Has to do with where people prefer to drink, right? And so we were really fortunate in that we got distribution in all the big retailers in town. At that time, there was Specs. There were a lot of, I would say, larger mom and pop liquor stores. And again, they were just kind of rallied behind it. And of course, they're rallying behind it because people are calling in asking for the product, which was phenomenal. Couple that with all the kind of free press we were getting at the time because people were hearing about the stories of the wait lists and those kinds of things. It was, really magical as a new brand. And so then, certain restaurants would pick it up, and, Riata was a big group early on that supported us, and then just kind of gradually grew. And then, then we would start hearing stories, and we were very specific about let's, really make sure we're taking care of our backyard. So, starting in Fort Worth, and then, starting to distribute over into the mid cities and then over into Dallas. It took us probably, I don't know, 6 months to really get out of DFW, and that's our distributor. Kind of, hearing people asking for it in Austin and so on. That's the pull that I referred to earlier. They don't, they won't just automatically, shotgun your product in all the locations. They need to hear, the consumers are demanding it.
Yeah, you said Fort Worth. Like Fort Worth, y'all obviously pillars of the community. Know a lot of people. It was easy to get people to rally around. Was there anything about going to Austin, San Antonio, Dallas that you had to pick up some new strategies because you weren't the hometown heroes?
Without a doubt.
So what do you do then?
Well, we didn't have big marketing budgets. We were still, a startup company. So, guerrilla marketing tactics. We gave away a ton of product, did a lot of tastings. So Leonard and I were on the road a lot. Bars, restaurants, even retailers like Specs, they want the owners or distillers there kind of hand selling. And so we'd set up little, we had kind of our travel, suitcase, you set up a little banner and they'll maybe put you on a barrel and along with 4 or 5 other brands. And, it's literally hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
It's like who can win the, consumer. And so we did a ton of that. And we had to do that literally the whole, life cycle of the business.
Yeah.
Because we were constantly opening new markets. But, associating ourselves with, a lot of the charitable events in town, we looked at it as, big groups of people, high exposure. We stayed away from most traditional, marketing and advertising efforts like billboards and those kinds of things. It was really word of mouth, and anything we could find that could get liquid on lips and reach the largest number of people were efforts that we really focused on.
Do most people, when they pick I think I maybe fall into this category a bit, but do they usually say like, okay, I'm a whiskey drinker, this is my whiskey, or are you usually one of 3 or 4 whiskeys that they might drink?
It depends.
Okay.
I, for instance, am a whiskey lover. I love all kinds of whiskey.
Yeah.
But my regular, believe it or not, is TX because we developed that profile because we liked it. But I think some people have their favorites and their go-tos and don't deviate. Others like to try different kinds.
Yeah.
It just depends on the person, I think.
All right. So the blend had taken off. That was kind of your lead horse. I remember before y'all even released the stuff that you were barreling, I thought in my heart at one point, this was before we ever knew each other, I was like, man, I hope what they're actually going to make is as good as the blend, because the blend had become really good and really famous. So let's kind of talk about what was happening while that was all going on. You were obviously now going to start distilling and brewing your own. Is it brewing? I guess it's distilling. How did that all move forward?
So when we, importantly, we were running parallel paths. So the minute we were launching the blend, we were also distilling. And so we had, fermenters, and that was another thing that we spent a lot of time researching and figuring out, because there are all these kind of strict requirements in making bourbon, and these are what are called standards of identity that are developed by the federal government in order to call it bourbon, like champagne or so forth. There were very few things that you could change, to make yourself different. So, the grain had to be, at least 51% corn. You could use rye or wheat as your, really, you could use any grain as a flavor grain, as we called it. And then malted barley. So those were the 3 elements. Yeast was a big component, and then the barrel. So those are really the only things that you can tweak to modify taste profile. So when we were setting out to develop our mash bill as well as our mashing process, one of the things that we keyed in on was the yeast. So most people would go and buy commercially available distiller's yeast. Well, the yeast can contribute up to 25% of the flavor of the product. So long story short, and it's a really cool story, but it'll take too much time here. But we ended up capturing our own yeast from the wild, cultivating it, and that's now what the bourbon uses, and has since day one. And so it provides its own unique profile. And those are, elements that we really were proud of, because no one at that time had captured their own yeast for whiskey since, probably into Prohibition.
Do you know what it's going to taste like, even though it's going to take 4 years for the mash and for everything to be distilled? Do you just have like a hope that, man, I hope this tastes like what we think it's going to taste like 4 years from now? Or is there something that you can taste before you go all in on this 4-year bet to go, I think we're going to land right here taste wise?
Well, generally what your flavor grain is going to provide.
Okay.
So if it's wheat, it's going to be a little sweeter, a little softer, so to speak. If it's rye, it's going to be a little spicier. So that the yeast really changes the flavor dramatically. So you could get, fruit, you could get earthy, you could get a lot of different elements there. But where we were testing was off of the still, which is what we call white dog. So that's the white lightning, the stuff, the clear liquid coming off the still. A lot of people don't realize whiskey doesn't come off brown.
It doesn't?
No, it's the barrel that gives its brown color.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's clear. It looks like vodka, but it doesn't taste anything like vodka. So, we spent a lot of time, effort, really honing in on what we wanted that distillate or white dog to taste like.
Yeah.
And then, did we know at the time exactly what it would taste like, 2 years, 3 years down the road? No. But we knew it was going to have the characteristics, generally speaking, that we were looking for.
And isn't it a big deal, like what type of barrel you pick and what the barrel's made of, or is that not a big deal?
It is a big deal. So again, one of those standards that you have to adhere to is that bourbon has to be aged in a new white oak charred barrel.
Okay. And just so that I understand this, when you walk in, I've been in your distillery, but there's the huge, what do you call them? The big containers, the fermenters.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but in like 2 or 3 minutes, how does whiskey get made?
Yeah, sure. Starts with the grain. So, at our facility, we contract with a specific farmer. We actually were specifying which grains he was growing for us. And that can go in a totally different direction. But he would deliver those grains. We would mill them to a spec so that we had. So, depending on the particle size, it will ferment better or worse. So you run it through a mill into this, what looks like a fermenter, but it's closed. And that's the cooker. So steam, water goes into that, cooks the grain. And then you add your last grain, which is the malted barley. And that turns a lot of those starches into fermentable sugars.
And how long did that process take?
A couple hours.
Okay.
So then you transfer that into a fermenter and pitch your yeast. So then, the yeast consumes all of that sugar, eats that sugar, and what it's creating is alcohol and CO2.
Okay.
And so that will ferment for, anywhere from, different distillers do it differently, but anywhere from 3 days to 6 days. So at the end of that, you have basically what we referred to as beer. Not the beer like Miller Lite, but it's a distiller's beer. And so we, in bourbon production, traditional bourbon production, you do not remove the grain from the distillation process. So we had at, Whiskey Ranch, we had a 52-foot column still. So we feed that beer into the top, and there's, 25 different plates. It's kind of a refractionation column if you think of it in terms of oil and gas. But basically running that mash down through the still, injecting steam through the bottom, and all that alcohol vapor is being vaporized into and captured and ultimately condensed and captured into a vat, which is your distilled spirit.
And then it moves to the barrel.
Yes.
And it just sits there for 4 years.
Yep. Pretty
What
much.
What do you do? Just kind of every now and again peek in and look at it. Like, is there any? You just kind of just
No, you definitely do sampling. So we at that point had a full lab with scientists on staff.
Okay.
That would go in. And interestingly, when you're building large rick houses, which is the barns that the barrels age in, we were building 20,000 barrel rick houses at Whiskey Ranch, which is equivalent to, distillers in Kentucky. Interestingly, they're not air conditioned, they're not climate controlled. You need a lot of airflow through them, but they're four or 5 stories tall. So the barrels that mature on the bottom level will taste different than the ones on the top level. And that's due to climate. This is where the romantic side of whiskey comes in.
Oh yeah.
Where you're allowing the elements to, impart a lot of the flavors into the whiskey. And very quickly, why I say that is, the white oak is porous enough. If you think of it like a group of straws, that's like the layer of the white oak, and so you char it for a couple of reasons to kind of expose those lignans and lactones, the kind of chemical elements in the white oak that impart a lot of flavor, but also that char gives it that kind of brown amber color. And so when it gets hot outside, those fibers expand and allow the distillate to go into the wood.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it gets cold, they contract and they send it back in. And so it's that, expansion, contraction that ultimately creates a lot of the taste profile of the whiskey.
And when you get a barrel, has it ever stored anything in it before? And can you use them once it's done? Like, what happens with barrels?
You can only use it, it's brand new when you get it for bourbon. You can only use it once for straight bourbon. But then you can use it. A lot of Scotch is aged in used bourbon barrels. They don't like the really harsher, kind of darker tones and harsher flavors. But you can use it for other styles of whiskey, just not straight bourbon.
Yep. All right. We've kind of talked about a couple pillars of the business: the blend, the product that y'all made yourselves. At what point did you say we need to buy a golf course and build a huge whiskey ranch? Like, how does that become? Assuming there was a great reason for doing it, but like, how did that kind of idea formulate, and what were you thinking there?
Yeah. So the first distillery we were in, the first building we were in, was about 40,000 square feet. Half of it was devoted to distillation, the other distillation bottling, the other half was storage. Within 6 months of selling the blend, we looked around and kind of were doing the math, and we realized that we didn't have the capacity to fulfill demand if demand stayed where it was. So at that moment, we had to decide that we're going to expand. Well, it's not easy to kind of just build a distillery. We knew it was going to take a long time. And so started to put the pieces together of expanding and building a new facility. I had to go through it all again. We had to, put together a proposal, go raise a lot more money this time. Thankfully, we had a track record, and it was a little bit easier the second go round. But the criteria that we needed, we studied Kentucky distillers a lot, and had been to their facilities and saw that most of them were on anywhere from 100 acres to up to 500 acres. And we wondered, why is that? Was that just how they set it up in the early days, people's farms? Well, what we realized is that the aging barns, or the rick houses, they were separating them from one another, because effectively, if those catch on fire, there's no, putting it out.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You've got millions of gallons of flammable liquid, and, they would separate and, put them in different places so that if one ever had a catastrophic, issue, then it wouldn't affect the rest of them. Mm-hmm. So you needed that kind of elbow room, so to speak. And so that was one of the criteria that we were using when we were looking for another, location. And we looked all around for, probably 6 months. Looked outside of the city, looked at a couple of small ranches. But again, going back to, the criteria we used for the first distillery, which was we really wanted to be centrally located if we could. We wanted it to be a destination for, our fans and customers. We had a vision to, make it truly kind of a whiskey wonderland, as we later started referring to it as, all the things that we loved about it. And, we wanted people to get up close and personal with it and experience it. And so one day we're kind of scouring the internet and we come across a listing of a golf course that was for sale. And we, if I'm being honest, we didn't really know anything about that golf course. I'm not from Fort Worth. Leonard isn't either. But very quickly we realized that, there was a tremendous amount of history at that golf course. Well, long story short, we ended up negotiating with the folks. They were really struggling with trying to keep the golf course running. At one time it was a great private club, and then it became a private public club, and then it became just a public club. And they were really struggling. And it was owned by two gentlemen that were really tired of footing the bill, and really wanted to find at the time they wanted to find a golf operator, but I don't think they could find one to do it. So we convinced them, that we would be a good steward and an operator, and ended up buying, Glen Garden,
Yep.
which for the listeners that don't know, this was an infamous golf course where Byron Nelson and Ben Hogan grew up caddying and learning to play the game.
Yep. There's a video of Ben Hogan would like sleep in the bunkers at night or something. It was on Golf Channel recently. And Whiskey Ranch was going to be the distillery, but it was also going to be a place that people could come. It was just another way for people to get to know the brand. I've been to several events there. People could rent out rooms. But is it almost a given that if you're going to grow a whiskey distillery to a certain size, like you eventually have to build a facility like this? You can't really lease them from other people.
No, you have to own it. And some distilleries don't really put, tourism or customers experience at the forefront. That was always important for us. And so all the way down to how we designed, the still house, where we have two staircases that go up, one on either side of the still, where, any guest can come on a tour and get up close and personal with the whole process. That was all by design. But yeah, we wanted a place that, people would not only come and learn about our product and, experience it for themselves, but, could hang out and, drink whiskey and have events.
That's awesome.
And play golf.
And there's still 9 holes, right?
Well, when we were running it, we had all 18.
Okay.
So we had to modify a couple of holes because we built in the center of the center of the property. But we rerouted. We had 18.
So the business has kind of been built. You guys were around for a while. The brand took off. Once you have a really great product, and that there's demand, and you kind of have a playbook for going into different markets. How does your marketing evolve from being just a word of mouth to, I feel like everywhere I go in Fort Worth now is like the TX Whiskey branded room at Dickey's Arena or wherever. How does marketing level up once you've kind of hit a certain scale of your business?
Yeah, after a while, when you've converted, the early adopters, then you have to start thinking about, how do I reach the next level of consumers? And we tried a lot of different things. We threw a lot on the wall to see what would stick, and made a lot of mistakes along the way. But ultimately, as you grow, as the company evolves and grows in size, you start to make some calculated risks and make decisions on what can we be a part of, or how can we reach the next consumer. And one of the things that was really big for us early on, even in the first months of the distillery was, we wanted to be a part of the community. And so we would pick certain things, that we could be a part of. The stock show and rodeo here was one of them. We worked with, Brad Barnes and a number of other folks on creating a trophy bottle for the winners of the rodeo, and I think they're still doing that. Hopefully, they are. But that was a lot of fun. The Schwab Challenge at Colonial, we would do, because we could customize our bottle in a lot of different ways. We would take the tartan of, the Colonial plaid and, create bottles and give them to the players and those kinds of things. The bigger you get, the more, capital you have devoted to marketing, the more things you can do. And so we gradually over time would, invest more and more into those events locally, but then also outside of our hometown. At one point, and this was, I would say, one of the mistakes that we made was we did a major marketing investment in the Houston Texans, thinking that we were going to get a lot of exposure, in that stadium, and it just didn't work out.
Yeah. Why do you think?
I think it's just there's in venues like that where there's so many brands clamoring for eyeballs, and also being liquor. We're kind of hamstrung in a lot of ways just being liquor. We obviously don't want to be showcased around minors. We don't want to we can't in a lot of ways sell in certain stadiums, maybe beer only, for instance. So we thought that, hey, there's a lot of people that go through there, maybe it's worth it. It also came with some kind of digital media, and it just didn't garner the attention that we wanted to. But at the end of the day, we would build campaigns and, with varying degrees of success. But what worked for us was just being out there, trial, getting liquid on lips, being present. People wanted to meet us, and we signed a lot of bottles, which was a lot of fun, but at times could be very tiring.
Yeah. You said the word mistake. As you sit here right now, is there anything else, like one or two things that come to mind that if somebody's ever thinking about doing this, is like, we should not have done this? Any obvious mistakes you made in hindsight?
Probably one of the biggest was trying to go into too many markets too fast.
Okay.
We got to the point where we built out a leadership team and had, a CMO and, head of sales and, whole team of people that were devoted to helping, drive strategy. And, at the end of the day, it came down to, deep versus wide. Yeah. So, we really believe to let our people, make, decisions and then support them, and hopefully, kind of, it works. And, one of the things that didn't work well was, kind of that wide strategy of trying to open too many markets at once, or at least in a short period of time. Because we needed people there, we needed investment dollars there, we needed a lot of things that we couldn't give it 110% of our attention to be successful. So we then, learned from that mistake, kind of captured back some of those resources, and then, pivoted to more of a deep strategy, and that was working for us.
We're going to talk about a little bit about the sale as we bring it home, but were y'all only in Texas always, or had you kind of gone nationwide? As
we weren't nationwide. We had picked markets. I think we were in 20 something states at the time of the sale. But Texas was by far our largest market.
And as you're going to those new markets, was that the distributor coming to you saying, hey, let's go to Georgia? Or was that y'all saying, hey, we'd like to go to Georgia? Or
sometimes distributor would say, we'd really like for you to open this market. There seems to be considerable demand. Sometimes we would agree and sometimes we wouldn't. Sometimes we said, no, we don't want to open that market yet. And then other times it would be, maybe someone on our staff that would say, we really feel like we should open a market.
Yeah.
So it just depended on the market.
And high level, was there you kind of just talked about how one of the mistakes was growing too quickly and getting into these markets maybe unprepared. But towards the end, as an operator, did y'all have a playbook for how you entered a new market?
We did. It had to be that we could, have a physical presence there, that we had earmarked enough dollars for both sales efforts and marketing efforts, and then distributor support. So having enough, point of sale materials and all those things. Again, purposeful. We weren't really big on keychains and hats and all that kind of stuff, but we would really tailor a lot of our point of sale materials to the market.
I don't know. One thing y'all did really well, and I think I've told you this, but the gift giving around Christmas, I am lucky enough to be the receiver of like 4 TX bottles of whiskey for Christmas every year, but it's because the companies can brand that piece of cloth around the top, whatever their firm is. And I thought that was genius and has kept me nice and served for many Christmases now.
Yeah, I mean the customization is big. Again, it's that another touch point, another piece of the story that people can gravitate to. I think that contributed to our success. I can't tell you how many people tell me I've gotten 4 different bottles with 4 different logos on them. So it's just really gratifying.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the sale and bring it home. So you guys started in 2009 at probably the worst possible time and built this incredible company over a decade or more. When did the light start coming on that it was maybe going to be time to sell?
Well, interestingly, I don't know that we had that light in our minds, but we did have, we'd taken private equity. We, had just completed Whiskey Ranch in November of 17. And so in our minds, that was the next big step to lay the pathway for the next 10 years.
And really quick, did you take the private equity to build Whiskey Ranch, or was that another round along the way?
Yes. So I mentioned it earlier, when we decided to expand, we needed to raise more capital.
Got it.
And that was part of it. And I think so we completed the facility in November of 17. And then right after the new year that year in 18, our sales had been growing pretty dramatically. We had kind of gone from what I would say, in the industry, there's the craft distillers, which are all the kind of the small guys. And then the opposite end of the spectrum are all the really big guys like the Beams and the, Diageos of the world. But there's very few that enter the middle market is what I would call them. And, Nielsen is a service that people follow in the industry of case sales and so on. So people can start to, get a sense for how much volume you're doing as a brand. Well, we had kind of found ourselves, sneaking out of that craft distilling world and into that middle market world, which is, right. All of the big guys are just kind of hoping that somebody gets there. And big companies don't build brands anymore. They buy brands. Mm-hmm. And that's just been the way it's been for a long time now. And so, or very rarely do they build brands. So we were kind of entering that, our case volume was entering that middle market. And then all of a sudden the phone starts ringing kind of first quarter of, 18, by multiple people. And so we were flattered, of course. And, but we were, had our blinders on and we're, planning on, what's the next 10 years going to be. And at this time there was also a lot of activity in the M&A market in spirits, and there had been some really big multiples occurring in some of those transactions. And so we would report back to our board of, we've, heard from these people, and, isn't that flattering? And, but, we're just going to kind of keep going. And they're like, well, maybe you should have a conversation with them. And so we're like, okay, we did. And so, over that spring, there was a couple of groups that were really aggressive and just, hey, we love what you're doing. We can, with our sales force, we can really supersize this brand, and, all the great things, that you would want to hear. But still, we were just kind of like, wow, we just, just set the groundwork for the next, 10, 15 years. And nevertheless, it got to the point where they were just so aggressive that, in our conversations with the board, they're like, we should test the market.
Yeah. And
so, we were very careful about that. We had a very small curated process. And ultimately, there was one group that was really aggressive, and partly because they were lacking a sizable North American whiskey in their portfolio, and that was Pernod Ricard, which is a number 2 spirits company in the world, I think.
Wow.
So they have Jameson and Belvedere and lots of other big and great brands, but they owned Wild Turkey for a spell and then sold it somewhere along the way. And so we're lacking a significant North American whiskey, and North American whiskey was really hot at the time. It probably still is. And so they just kind of came with a number that we worked and couldn't refuse. And so that's what did it.
When was that? Because Q1 of 2018 is when the first solicitations kind of came in. When did you actually make the decision that we're going to go with an offer? Was that
about a year later?
Okay. So that whole year is kind of business as usual, but you're also kind of dealing with, we might have to sell this thing.
Yeah. So it kind of started as, the flattering meetings and phone calls, and then, more and more interest was there, and more conversations were had at the board level, and, ultimately figuring out, if we were going to test the market, who would our bankers be, and yada, yada, yada.
Do you value an alcohol business based on like an EBITDA multiple plus some goodwill of the brand, or how are these businesses valued in general?
I mean, a metric is kind of dollar per case, generally speaking, or, I would say most metrics are around revenue per case. Of course, every deal's different.
Yep.
But in our case, it was, we had a significant capital investment in, the future of the business and building Whiskey Ranch. And, at that time, the capacity of Whiskey Ranch, production capacity of Whiskey Ranch, made us the largest whiskey producing operation outside of Kentucky and Tennessee.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of built-in capacity, which was very attractive for someone like Pernod that could really, hit the gas pedal.
All right. I wanted to spend the last few minutes on what it's kind of like to sell a business, especially one that you've built for 10 years. I'm not saying with every entrepreneur, your business somehow becomes a little part of your identity. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. We shouldn't let our businesses, be all too consuming. But for someone that it was like a community, it was a pillar, you're a pillar of the community. You're kind of, like you said, you were attached to it. Like the first question is, was there a point in the sales process where your mind had already gone too far? Like, we're going to sell, like you usually hear where there's like a point of no return, or was it always like, look, if it sells, it sells. If it doesn't, it doesn't?
Definitely hit that point that this is going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then we're in a heap of trouble, because at that point, once the announcement came, your distributors start getting squeamish because they're worried about losing a brand. And so then they don't necessarily want to put forth a lot of effort into selling your brand. And so if it didn't go through, it would have been a giant mess that we were going to have to dig out. So, I think probably after the announcement of the sale, and then for, the next, I think we had 30 to 40 days closing period, which was, I lost a lot of nights of sleep on that one. But ultimately, and at the time, to your point about, where was my mind at? They were talking about keeping us on for a period of time and basically, no change, keep running it how you have been. Well, in reality, really the week after the sale, we showed up and, they were already kind of thinking about how to change things and so forth.
Yeah.
And it was more of a, ambassador role at that point. And then COVID hit.
When did you close?
In August of 19.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah.
When you woke up the day after the wire hit and you had closed, did you feel any different? Was it sad? Was it happy? Was it both?
Didn't feel any different with the money wise, from a money standpoint. Felt different, like more concerned what's going to happen next. It wasn't until probably right after Christmas that year, that there was kind of, I don't want to say a depression, but there was, a mourning period.
Yeah.
Kind of a, internal mourning period. Because to your question about identity, our identities were 100% wrapped up into it.
Yeah.
I mean, our names were on the bottle, our names were on the distillery, we were the faces, our faces were on the box. We were the ones that, people requested us to come to their events and sign bottles and, all the things. And, having to go through the process of detaching yourself from that, I wasn't anticipating it, being hard, but it was hard for, I don't know, a couple months or something.
How do you do that?
But I will say this. So I will say that towards the end, we had gotten to be, a big enough company where you were starting to feel like it was a little corporate. And I was starting to feel a little bit tired of not having anonymity.
Yeah.
And not that I was a celebrity at all, but, locally, there weren't many places I could go. Even, use this as an example. I couldn't go to my, the liquor store that's closest to my house and just get a bottle of something without being, bombarded by the staff or whatever the case may be. And that started to wear on me a little bit.
Yeah.
And then, now flipping back to that period of kind of unwrapping or unwinding myself from, the brand, that started to feel after that kind of month or two of, mourning, if you will. After that, things started, I could start going places and, it's amazing how quickly people forget or, and that felt really good. Started to get some of the anonymity back.
Do you think you'll be attached to the brand forever? Is that I mean, I'm sure there's a part of you that wants to be, but it is Firestone and Robertson Distilling Company.
To some extent, yes. Unless they decide to, they have pulled our faces off the box, I think I've heard. If they decide to take the name off the bottle, and there'll be a detachment. But I mean, I think we'll forever be the founders of the business.
Yeah.
Which is pretty
That's cool.
awesome to say. And, look forward to, telling those stories to my kids someday.
Yeah. I just have to imagine the day after a sale or the next time you walk into the office after it's over, there's just got to probably be that little feeling of like, that was your baby. That was your deal.
No, it's real. It's definitely real. But I mean, I'm still young and, looking forward to,
We don't have
So
to go
what's
into it
next?
on this episode, but I know you got some cool things in the works, and maybe we'll be able to reconvene here in a few years and talk about those things.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome.
Troy, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Chris.
As we sat back years ago and were envisioning where Fort was going to go, we realized we needed to bring in a global workforce, a remote workforce that could work with us. And a few of the reasons why were obviously cost, which I think is the first thing that comes to everybody's mind. But then when we talk about shifts, a 24-hour shift, and maybe you can go a little further there, and some of the other benefits that we've realized as we've gone on. And now we sit here today in 2022. At the time we first had this was maybe 10 employees. Now we're at 46.
Mm-hmm.
And as you think about the next chapter and how we're scaling, it's almost inconceivable that we would do it without Relay Human Cloud. So can you just talk a little bit more to how the shifts work at Fort and the productivity and some of the other benefits that we've learned about working with a global workforce?
It's actually been pretty transformational from how we think about how we're going to not only get stuff done today, but how we're going to get stuff done in the future as we grow. And so when you start going down that path of thinking about you're going to start working with people on the other side of the world, right? There's a lot of questions that come up. How are we going to do it? How are we going to train them? How are we going to manage them? Who's managing them? All those things come up. What we found with Relay Human Cloud was that all those thoughts had already been taken care of, and that we could focus on what type of talent is there that can join our team. Does it fit our need? And once we saw that all that thought and energy had already been put into the operational part of managing and running a team, and the thing that we focus on here locally, then it was just a matter of finding the talent. And what I think that Relay Human Cloud has done really well is find a lot of great talent. And, these are people that are highly educated, that can provide a ton of value to a company like ours that otherwise we can't find here. And obviously it's at a high or a extreme cost savings compared to what we could find here. So what we started looking for was how could we supplement what we currently do with the team overseas. And it started off for us from an accounting perspective. We have a lot of these things that are repetitive, task-driven, that just never end. And we knew that our team was taking on a lot of work during the day, which was limiting our ability to take on new properties. And so we have a choice. We can hire another accountant or another staff accountant, or promote somebody and bring that person on. But we're really just trying to solve, at first, a repetitive task. So when we reached out to Relay Human Cloud, we discovered that not only could we solve that problem, we could get a very qualified person that could not only do that, help support on a lot of other things. And so very quickly it turned into, we're trying to solve some repetitive tasks to bringing on more and more team members that were actually helping us grow our accounting department without having to bring on a lot of people here. And so that just continued to grow. So since then, we've brought on additional assistants, but it started with accounting. The benefit of having a team working globally is that you get the benefit of around the clock, and it never ends. And so because we have a team here working on things, obviously the time runs out during the day, but there's things that they're gonna come into work tomorrow, and they're gonna have to start doing that again. One of those things is, and a good example is cash reconciliations of every bank account. At Fort Capital, we have 50 bank accounts, and there's cash reconciliations that have to happen every day. Well, that was something that locally a team had to come into work and start working on every day. Well, that just means there's other things they can't start working on. What happened immediately with our team at Relay Human Cloud was that overnight they were processing all those. They were doing all that accounting work on the back end, so that when our team showed up in the morning, they could start on more important tasks that were happening locally, directly related to the property. And that allowed us to create efficiencies. And so that's just one benefit. We can go through an entire list of things that we have discovered that overnight can be done to help increase the efficiency of the accounting team. That extends beyond the accounting team. It also extends to the property management team, processing invoices. So Fort Capital, we have millions of square feet of industrial space across the country. And with that, you have a lot of invoicing that's happening at all times. You could name a million things, whether it's paying bills, contractors, tenants, whatever it is. There's a million invoices and that can all be processed in India overnight, so that when our team comes in, they're not spending their day processing invoices, which allows us to get to more proactive accounting measures, so that we're using our accounting team to actually push the company forward, not keep up with what's coming at us, right? And so we found a ton of efficiencies by having the 24-hour workday.
So following that up, it was also important to us, because that could have been done anywhere, but we wanted it happening under one roof with people that we knew, that we worked with daily, that were part of our team. And so as you think about these people that are halfway across the globe, it still doesn't seem like it seems like they're in the next room over.
Right. And that's a good point. And I think what's important to understand there is that this group of individuals that are working in India are working directly for our team. They are a part of our team. They're in our systems. They communicate with our team every day. They are not just an extension of our team, they are a part of our team. And so it is much, much different than if you go hire a third-party service out there in the world that you're asking to process invoices, who you're having to send critical or important data to that is, or might be sensitive, right? Information. We actually have all that internal, and this team is a part of that internal team. And so it's a much different way to look at outsourcing than if you're just outsourcing it, even here locally in America. There's a risk there that you're sending your data to somewhere else. This is all happening internally.